Okay. So I was thinking that with the current mental wall rising up between Russia and the West, at least that's how I would describe it, one thing has been very, very striking in the Norwegian debate. And that is how quickly we all fall back to very simplistic images of Russia as something different and dangerous from us, and how little knowledge there actually is about Russia and our own history with Russia. So within this frame, I think both your tremendous work is extremely relevant to put out there and to amplify. So I hope to, I've never done a conversation like this before, but I hope we can cover three broad themes. The theme of war, the theme of the state and the state's relation to the individual, and finally revolution, and all pertaining to the big question, where is Russia moving today? So let's start with the war that we have just witnessed in Ukraine. I have picked up just a phrase from one of your books where you note that, and I quote, "We have never lived without the war, and probably we cannot." So my observation would be that war has been one of the hallmarks of the Putin regime, starting with the war in Chechnya and now the war in Ukraine. So my question to you is, to what extent can the mobilization and the support for Putin's approach in the crisis in Ukraine be seen as a demonstration of this inclination to war in the Russian population?
Ну, как раз когда я уезжала сюда, я прочла в прессе, что уже официально установлено, что на Украине воюет 35 тысяч русских добровольцев.
Dagene før jeg skulle reise hit, fikk jeg lese i en avis at det var offentlig kjent at 35 000 frivillige leiesoldater fra Russland var involvert i krigen i Ukraina.
Я не буду говорить о военной технике, о регулярных частях регулярных, а именно 35 тысяч человек, которых смогли организовать через военкоматы, через интернет, и эти люди нашлись.
Jeg skal ikke si noen ting om militært utstyr og om de regulære styrkene som blitt involvert, men jeg vil snakke om disse 35 000 enkeltmennesker som blitt funnet, mobilisert og organisert via krigskommissariatnettverk eller via internett til å gå i denne krigen.
Конечно, это идет очень сильная информационная.
Selvfølgelig det også et produkt av den informasjonskrigen eller propaganda som foregår på TV og massemedier. Vi ser slike fortellinger, eller teatraliserte fortellinger om for eksempel et barn har blitt korsfestet av ukrainske soldater, eller eldre blitt brent levende. Alle disse fortellingene som helt absurde, men iscenesatt for å styrke mytene som har eksistert hos folket.
Недавно, вот такая сценка, недавно моя подруга хоронила свою мать в Смоленской деревне. Она привезла ее с Москвы, это очень далеко, 600 километров, собралась вся деревня, только отвезли мать на кладбище, похоронили, собралась вся деревня, и уже через 15 минут bokvально дрались, ругались из-за Украины.
Jeg kan gi dere et ferskt eksempel. Jeg har en venninne, nær venninne, som har nylig mistet sin mor, og som ordnet begravelsen i hjemlandsbyen hennes, og tok like lang vei, 600 kilometer fra Moskva til Smolensk, det Smolensk region. Og begravelsen ble satt i stand, mange folk fra landsbyen ble invitert, seremonien ble holdt. Bare et kvarter etter at begravelsen var slutt, var folk opptatt med å krangle og slåss på grunn av det som skjedde i Ukraina.
Я думаю, что, конечно, вот когда я смотрела...
Jeg satt og observerte denne situasjonen, og at denne døde kvinnen var for lengst glemt, og hvor lett påtagelig eller tennbart var denne militære mentaliteten som ligger latent i folket, som egentlig var vedlikeholdt hele tiden under Sovjetunionen. Og slike begivenheter som seiersdagen, den 9. mai, feires det i Russland, meget høytidelig i over 60 år. Det illustrerer denne temperaturhøyden i denne militariserte forståelsen av verden. Jeg ble meget overrasket nylig da jeg kom for å hente mitt barnebarn, min jente på skolen, eller datter på skolen. Og da fikk jeg se at overalt på veggene i den skolen var det portretter og fortellinger om ikke noe annet enn andre verdenskrig. Man tror at disse små menneskene ikke har behov for noe annet enn å lære å krige.
И как раз там была огромная карта этого бывшего
Jeg
Советского
sto
Союза.
ved et verdenskart, eller et kart over den gamle Sovjetunionen som hang på veggen i denne skolen, og tenkte at dette har måttet eksistere ikke bare nylig, ikke bare under Sovjetunionen, men lenge før det. For denne type holdningen til verden har måttet være nødvendig for å ta over så stor del av verden som Russland er blitt da. Jeg har snakket med mange gutter som har vært i krigen i Tsjetsjenia, i krigen i Afghanistan, og jeg så at nei, de ville ikke dø, men det var mye enklere for dem å dø enn det ville vært for et menneske fra Vest-Europa.
Другое отношение к жизни.
De har en annen holdning til livet.
Умереть не так страшно.
Det å dø er ikke så skummelt. De menneskene som Putin nå sender inn i krigen i Ukraina, er stort sett mennesker fra bygda, mennesker som ikke har jobb eller inntekt, noen reiser av overbevisning, men de fleste er mennesker som ikke eier noen ting.
С одной стороны русский фанатизм, а с другой отношение к жизни. Она ничего не стоит.
På den ene siden er den russiske fanatismen eller nasjonalismen, og på den andre siden er verdien på livet. Livet er ingenting verdt.
Thank you. Another, I noted in the introduction how little we know about or understand about the historical backdrop to Russia's approach in the Ukraine crisis. And you have written an entire book on the Crimean War, an historical book. So I'm wondering whether you can give us some historical context, give us the historical context to Russia's actions on Crimea this spring. And I'm also wondering to what extent you accept the argument presented by the Russian authorities for why what they term voluntary reunification was in a way justified.
Yeah, I did write a book on the Crimean War, which came out in 2010, and when it did appear, no one paid any attention to it at all. It seemed like a very obscure war a long time ago. Although it actually did very well in Germany. The Germans apparently liked it because it was one big war they weren't responsible for. But then when the Ukrainian revolution took place and then the Crimea annexation, it all changed. Someone tweeted on Twitter, Crimea trending for the first time since 1854. So it suddenly was very much there, and so I was called upon to think about it. And I think, sure, there are Russian sensibilities about Ukraine historically and about the Crimea in particular that we need to be aware of. And I think part of the problem about the debate in the West is that it's difficult to say that without being accused of being pro-Putin. I'm not pro-Putin, I'm very anti-Putin. I go along entirely with what Svetlana's just said about the way Putin is using the war and has used previous wars in Chechnya and Georgia to stir up nationalist feeling and consolidate his dictatorship. And, you know, all the talk now of sixth column, fifth column elements, the attack on NGOs, Memorial in particular, disturbs me. All of these are very worrying and alarming signs. But nonetheless, going back to what happened when the Ukrainian revolution took place, I think the West made a number of really bad mistakes. It went in too quickly with its advisors, giving carte blanche to an interim government, allowing this interim government to have within its ranks 4 far-right elements, let's call them fascists, because that's what they are. I've seen them, I've been in their midst, they are fascists. This is not going to help a situation because it plays into Kremlin propaganda hands by allowing the Kremlin to play on all of these World War II memories, all of these memories about what fascism was for Ukraine and Crimea. And so there were mistakes that were made. I think we have to be aware of Russian sensibilities. Obviously, Crimea is terribly important for Russia historically because of that first Crimean War, because it's always been, Crimea in particular, but the whole Ukrainian littoral or shoreline has been on a sort of geopolitical fault line between Russia and the Islamic world or the Ottoman world, or now, you know, with so-called NATO expansion on the fault line between NATO and Russia's, what it sees as its sphere of interest as an inheritance of the Cold War. So it's a very sensitive area, and perhaps, you know, with hindsight, Western governments, NATO would have trod a little bit more carefully. But the situation we're in now is it seems to me intractable for the West, because, as Svetlana has said, 35,000 people have volunteered to go to what Putin is calling New Russia. Donetsk, Luhansk, but soon, I fear, a whole land corridor between Russia and Crimea. Whatever compromise Kiev makes will not be enough to keep them in any way part of Ukraine in a de facto sense. The police will be Russified. The, you know, economic aid will go to the eastern territories from Russia. Companies in the Russian-oriented areas will not register profits or any economic activity at all in the parts properly controlled by Kiev. This is a country which, a little bit like the Ottoman Empire was in the reign of Nicholas I in the 1840s, it will be a country unable to function properly because part of it will be effectively controlled by Russia. So this is what they call a frozen war, and it's an intractable situation, it seems to me, given where we've got to. The problem now is, I think, exactly the sort of thing that Svetlana was talking about. How can one work within Russia with forces that don't want war? Because there might be extremists who are prepared to go there and fight. But there's a lot of people in Russia who don't want war, who don't want this, who don't want this sort of regime either. The trouble is, how does one activate that consciousness, civic consciousness, and indeed I would say the root of it must be a historic consciousness, to mobilize for an alternative way of seeing what Russia's position in the world should be.
On the whole, how important do you think the kind of historical experience of Western warfare on Russia, as, for example, in the Crimean War, how much of a role do you think it plays?
Oh, enormous, because if you turn on Russian TV, which is basically now Kremlin TV, all you hear about is Western double standards. The hypocrisy of the West, which, allowed Kosovo, which invaded Iraq, Afghanistan, and why can't Russia support those who are threatened, so to speak, by the suppression of their language, by what Russian TV calls a fascist junta in Kyiv. So this is seen as, this is something that easily plays into this way of thinking that I think many Russians still have, which is a legacy of the Cold War and their isolation from more reliable sources of information other than state-controlled media, to sort of get beyond this sort of conspiracy theory, which the Kremlin absolutely puts out every night on television.
I'm struck by how these campaigns, these wars, reify the Russian state, or bring the Russian state into kind of a unity and gives it new strength. And I want to now turn to the subject of the state and the individual in Russia. And again, I have a quote from you. When you describe the red person, or the Soviet and post-Soviet man, you say that the state has become their cosmos. The big idea becomes their life. And your project has been to kind of visualize the individual, where in your eyes everything happens. And I'm curious about, when you look at Russia today, how is the individual today threatened by kind of a new collectivity, or nearly a new state cult? Is that what we're seeing today? If you could reflect upon that.
Вы знаете, за всем стоит огромное разочарование, которое пережила страна.
Behind everywhere, there is a great disappointment that the whole country was been through.
В 90-е годы вдруг появилась надежда, что вот завтра будет хорошая жизнь.
In the beginning of the 90s, we got hope that tomorrow we'll have a good life.
Вот эти какие-то репортажи супермаркетов, которые показывали по телевизору, что вот завтра это будет у нас.
We got reports from malls, and we thought that tomorrow we'll have the same.
И откуда питалась эта наивность, этот романтизм, даже у элиты, это уму непостижимо сегодня.
And today it is very hard to understand how naive and romantic we could have been, even the elite. And this illusion of tomorrow have been destructed by the reality. The most important fabrics were closed down, the architectural bureaus were closed down, the intellectuals were starting to earn their money by cleaning, by selling things out in the streets. Those intellectuals were hoping and expecting that the other people would finally be given the opportunity to read Solzhenitsyn, Shalamov, study the truth. But those people were tempted to do quite different things. They were passing by those books. They were running towards new values. They were engaged with their own survival. They were not inspired by literature, but they were inspired by the money and economic opportunities they got. Finally, they could buy a car. Finally, they could travel abroad. Finally, they could have some better food and clothes.
И в это время все время было такое ожидание, вот Запад нам поможет.
At that time, we were all the time expecting that West will help us.
Как Запад мог помочь этой огромнейшей стране, уму непостижимо.
I just still cannot realize how the West could help this huge country.
Запад не помог в том смысле, как хотели.
The West didn't help us as we wanted.
И в это время, когда интеллигенция мечтала, говорила, там, читала, страну разграбили.
While intellectuals were dreaming and expecting and reading, the country was stolen and robbed.
И даже те либералы, которые начинали и были вокруг Ельцина, они первые, многие из них первые обогатились.
And even those politicians who were supporting liberal ideas of Yeltsin were the first people who became rich. And those people who were striving for the new life were struck by the revelation that all those hopes were crushed, all those hopes that they were having while they went for these demonstrations and in streets where hundreds of thousands of people were gathering to demonstrate their ideas for the democracy, when monuments of the communistic leaders were turned down. The only thing it led to that oil that belonged to the state was finally belonged to some people like Abramovich. And that Putin was only having billions of dollars abroad.
И, в общем-то, началось то, что называется комплексом Веймарской республики. Да? Вот это унижение, оно переросло в жажду реванша.
And it led to the development what we call Weimar's Republic complex or consequence, when this disappointment led people to take revenge. Recently, I was in Germany and I was reading some newspapers, and I read a very naive and very typical understanding of what is going on in Russia now, because people tend to believe that Putin is crazy, and because of Putin is the reason of everything causes a problem. No, it's not Putin. Putin is a representative of a society order. He is a result and a demonstration of what people are craving for.
И тут элита, мы должны признаться, что Путин перехватил у нас инициативу.
And we, the elite, have to admit that Putin has taken over the initiative possibility that we had before.
Он действует классически.
He goes on a very classical way.
Первое, маленькая победоносная война, чтобы объединить народ.
First thing is a small war that unites people and brings a victory.
Второе, найти внутренних врагов. Это мы. Теперь мы считаемся национал-предателями.
Second step is
Это элита, да?
Find an internal enemy. And the internal enemy is us, the elite, and we are now the traitors.
И, конечно, киевская хунта, бандерлоги, ну, все, кто на Украине не хочет жить вместе с Россией.
And the third is an external enemy, is a Kiev junta, Banderites, all those who disagree with Russia.
И, конечно, началась война за русские интересы на Украине, потому что Путин считает Украину недогосударством. Это он не один раз говорил.
And Russia also tries to protect its own interests in Ukraine, and Putin has several times named Ukraine as an undeveloped state.
Его евразийский проект, с которым он вступил в третий срок, терпит полное фиаско без Украины.
He entered his third term as a president with the idea of a European Asian project, and now this project is dissolving because of Ukraine.
И, конечно, нужен огромный большой враг. И враг стала Европа, Америка. Отсюда появился лозунг «Мы не Европа».
And of course, what we need is a big external enemy, and this enemy is now Europe and America. And therefore, we have a slogan that we are not Europe.
И вот эти люди, которые сегодня у власти, у них деньги из кармана сыпятся, но их ведь серьезно не принимают в мире. Они как бы для мира просто шпана с деньгами.
And those government officials who actually have their pockets full of money are not taken seriously by the Western elite. They are just some bandits, actually.
И вот все эти такие страсти опасны просто Третьей мировой войной.
And all those passions can lead to a Third World War.
Потому что градус милитаризации, вот в России я недавно был в Москве, но даже меня, человека, выросшего там, пугает.
Because the level of the militarization in the people's mind, the temperature is so high that it scares me, the person who has always lived there.
Can I add something
Yes.
to that? Because I want to come back to your question about the cult of the state. I think there's another element to this which explains Putin's popularity or his ratings, that all of that exposure of Soviet history in the Gorbachev era, a lot of people resented it and found it very difficult because it clashed so much with how they had been schooled, the beliefs they had, the pride they took in their country and its achievements. It was very difficult for people to swallow it, especially since so much of it seemed to be coming from the West. You know, they were receiving moral lectures about how bad their history was. And it was also difficult for people because people lived in the Soviet Union by just sort of not thinking about the bigger questions, about what their relatives were involved in, if they were in the party, etc., etc. All of that was just out of people's sort of framework of thinking. And suddenly they were being forced to think about that in a way that made people very uncomfortable. So when Putin starts to talk, as he does from about 2005, that Russians should take pride in their Soviet history, when he lectures to school teachers that they should give a more positive assessment of Soviet history, when he begins to promote textbooks that essentially erase the memory of mass terror, reduce it to one small paragraph, when he says in a much quoted speech to teachers, we don't have to beat ourselves up over our history, people felt, at last I can feel good about being Russian. And that created the beginnings of what I think you're suggesting, this cult of the state, this tendency of Russians to defer thinking to the state. In 2011, there was a series of TV programs, Judgment of History, it was called, and they would debate big historical episodes in Russian and Soviet history, and they would have a for and against with uses of evidence, and then they would have TV viewers vote on whether they agreed with the motion. So, for example, they discussed collectivization, and it was put to people, mass collectivization was responsible for the death of millions of people, the ruining of millions of other people's lives. It had catastrophic consequences for agriculture. In Ukraine and Kazakhstan, it led to mass famine. But still, 91% of the viewers voted for the resolution that it was necessary for the industrialization of the country. And there was a whole series of these programs with almost identical voting in favor of policies of state violence to meet an end. I mean, I could give you other evidence of this sort of mentality, but you know, that is very important to the climate we now have in Russia, where people say what Putin is doing is good for Russia, what Putin is doing is necessary for the defense of Russian interests. And it comes from that failure, I would say, to consolidate a period of historical reckoning. The failure of, if you like, the elites, or the failure of the political system to stabilize itself for long enough for a proper reckoning with what had happened in the Soviet Union. And that's the sort of tragedy of the situation now.
I think for many of us, while you're talking, and I think what this whole Ukraine crisis has unleashed of a fear on our side is whether this particular type of state, the particular type of governance which was there during Stalin times, which I think we all have actually quite a good picture of what it amounted to, whether it's going to return. And I was thinking about two of your books where you describe this type of governance, both on your book on the Stalin repressions and you touch on it also in the Just Send Me Word, your recent book. And this type of governance seems to include this constant invoking of an enemy on the one side, and on the other hand, very violent practices against your own population within the state. So I was wondering whether you could kind of describe to us how it actually worked, and when you look at what's going on in Russia today, how similar is this type of governance?
No,
or are we exaggerating the parallel? Are we being afraid before we should be afraid?
Look, I don't think Putinism is going to return Russia to anything like Stalinism. No. Putinism is much closer in its character to what one might call Brezhnevism. And if we think about what Brezhnevism was, it had lost the will and probably the wherewithal for mass repression. It had prophylactic measures, it was like a police state, but its stability relied on the collective memory of what had gone before. Its stability relied on the fact that people, the dissidents were a very small number of people. Yeah? There might have been a lot of people who sympathized with them, but very few people would become political by distributing literature. And the reason for that, I believe, is because people had been brought up to be very careful about what they said, even what they thought, and certainly about what they said in public or would do publicly. So the collective memory of 1937, which comes down several generations, inhibited political activity, inhibited what we would in the West call a civic consciousness. And that paralyzed society in a way that's carried through right to today. If you think, Russia has now had 25 years since the collapse of communism. Where are the political parties? Where are the civic organizations? Where are the consumer organizations? Where are the professional bodies? Where's the free... they just have not developed. That's the huge disappointment of post-Soviet Russia. I could even say, where are the historians? We don't have Russian historians who are prepared to put their head on the block. They were the most crony of all the intellectual professions under the Soviet system. And they haven't found their civic courage. And that's the problem. It's not that the state is so powerful. I think that the Putin state is stable but quite fragile. It's jittery about the prospects of revolution. I think that's why it reacted so strongly to the Ukrainian revolution. It was afraid of a repetition of the Ukrainian revolution in Moscow. So it's not that the state is so all-powerful. I don't think it is. I don't think it even has a sort of coherent strategy or direction. It's that society is so weak. And that's the historical legacy of the Soviet system.
Exactly. Yes, so that brings me back to something you said, Svetlana, on the fact that the post-Soviet person doesn't have an experience with living in freedom, and at the same time the kind of craving for the big ideas in the Russian soul, so to speak. I was wondering, to what extent do you think that the Putin regime, which in a way for a long time basically offered increasing consumption, which I know that you dismiss as something which the Russian could live by, to what extent can Putin kind of reinvent himself and become a leader of a new great idea? do you think that is possible? Or will we see a new revolution simply because he will not be able to do that?
Но вы знаете, недавно
Not so long time ago, I was through the internet and through a website called Vlast or Power, where there was an anonymous poll, questioning of people in general, with the main question: are you prepared to sacrifice your own life or a life of your family for the sake of a great idea of the Russian world? 37% of respondents said yes. And those were people who were not forced to do so. They were not seen doing that. They were willingly expressing their opinion. I got really scared of those figures, and I realized that we, the elite, were handling with not the real people, but with our illusion, the idea of how it could be. At the same last time I was in Moscow, I found myself among rich people, that they had a celebration. There was a birthday party of a person who used to be my friend, and now he has become very rich. What I was surprised by was that they were singing Soviet songs, and they were all unanimously supporting Putin. And the next step of my journey, as you know, was a Smolensk region in a small, impoverished village where all the people unanimously were supporting Putin as well. And in my new book, Tiden Second Hand, that will be published here in the country in February, I think, I give examples of very many interviews of this kind, very many conversations with people. And all of those cannot accept not only those personal losses, but also the loss of pride, this humiliation of the Soviet people.
И вот это больше всего меня потрясло. За 10 лет, пока я писала книгу и проехала Россию там от Камчатки до Москвы.
And what I was shocked by with my observations that I was collecting for 10 years while I was working with this book, when I was traveling through Russia from Kamchatka to Moscow, was that everyone was so very disappointed with the loss of that great superpower that everybody was afraid of. And I asked a very simple question to the most of the people I talked to. Do you want to live in a normal, okay country like Denmark or so? Or do you want to live in a great country? 90% of those people said that they wanted to live in the great country.
И, конечно, Путин сам такой советский человек.
I would like to say that the opposition movement is now been demoralized. It's very hard to be a dissident, not against your own government, but your own people who are around you. And of course I agree with the idea that civil society is weak and it has been too young. It's all true. But at the same time, all these civil society institutions have been criminalized now. We know that people are being sent as foreign agents. Those human rights defenders, as the organization Memorial, has been banned, and they are now being turned down. And all people or organizations who receive subsidiaries from abroad are also called foreign agents. So those people and activists who went out to streets and squares in 2010 to promote democratic ideas are now lining and queuing in foreign embassies to achieve a foreign visa. The immigration is huge, much more than in 1990s.
И мои друзья шутят, что нашла время, когда вернуться. 10 лет жила за границей, а вот сейчас, когда такие времена, ты вернулась. Действительно, у всех ощущение, что это надолго. И это надо признать, что мы живем с чувством поражения.
I have been living abroad for 10 years, and my friends are mocking on me, saying that you could not find any better time to come back, because everyone has a feeling that this is going to last. And I have to admit that we all have a feeling of a lost battle.
Our time is running out, so I'm going to let Landa Fajis get a couple of minutes at the end.
Just one thing. I mean, I agree that the opposition is not just demoralized. I'd say the opposition is probably finished as a potential force to overturn Putinism for the moment. And yeah, there's been a mass emigration of those who turned out on Bolotnaya Square. But coming back to what Svetlana said about, do you want to have a great country or a normal country? The thing is, the elite want their cake and to eat it, because they want to have the power of being at the top of a great country with an aggressive foreign policy, which is what the Putin regime wants for its purposes, but they also want to send their children to English schools, by English football clubs, my own, unfortunately. They want to have their houses in the south of France, in Tuscany, and in all the fashionable places of the world. And actually, there is a glimmer of hope to unseat Putin, because at the moment it looks very much like no one really knows what's happening inside the Putin elites. But it does seem like he's part of an elite of Siloviki who are increasingly isolated from the tier of the elite immediately below them. Now, if you go to London, let alone if you live in London, you become politically suspect to the Kremlin. The patriotic place for the elite to go on holiday is the Crimea. So, if we attack the elite immediately below the inner elite, if we stop their kids going to private schools in England, if we clean up our financial institutions so we don't let them launder their dirty money, if we take away their assets, freeze their bank accounts, there may, just may, be a split in the political elites of Moscow. So that if another opportunity arises where the opposition comes out onto the streets, and it just may well be that circumstances develop in a way, unfortunately probably it will take some bloodshed, but in a way that the elites become split. Because you know, the inner elite will want the crackdown, and those with the assets in the West may begin to question the policies of the. So that, it seems to me, is the only hope.
Okay, so on that kind of, I don't know if it was a positive note or not,
Well, it was
actually. But,
brighter than what we heard before.
We can discuss that afterwards. But I think we'll have to end here. We could definitely have continued for another couple of hours. Thank you so much for being with us, and thank you to the audience. Have a nice afternoon.